Alright guys, in today's lesson we're going to learn specifically how to dodge and burn. So, we're going to start by opening Photoshop. I'm going to go to File, I'm going to go Open Recent, and I'm going to open an image that we had open earlier. We talked earlier about resizing images and making them smaller and bigger. This is actually a smaller image, so hopefully the stuff that I apply will happen faster. To dodge and burn, you're going to use the button right here. This button for you may either look like a little black magnifying glass, it may look like a hand, or it may look like a sponge. If you haven't really done much with Photoshop, it will probably look like this. So let's go ahead and talk really quick about this. First of all, dodging and burning on your image is pretty straightforward. You're going to deal with these three buttons and a little bit right up in here. The one other thing that you're probably going to want to deal with is an area over here on the right hand side called layers. I don't like to do all of my major work on a single layer. Now, I know we haven't talked about this up to this point, but for me it's important. Layers are like a deck of cards. Basically, you have 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. You can add layers, you can take layers away. You always only see the top layer and so on and so forth. So, in this case, we're going to take this picture, we're going to duplicate it so we have a duplicate to work on so we don't actually touch the original. To duplicate a layer in Photoshop is actually really easy. All you have to do is hold down your Command or your Control key, depending on whether you're on PC or Mac, and hit the letter J. I now have a new layer called Layer 1. If I want to rename that layer, I just click one time on Layer 1 and make sure, actually maybe I have to do it twice. I have to do it twice on CS4. And then we can call it whatever we want. So I'm going to call this Dodge Burn Layer. Very rarely do I rename layers, but when you start getting a bunch, every now and then you have to. So now I have two pictures exactly the same. These little eyes tell me whether or not a layer is visible. Right now they're both visible, but I'm only seeing the top one. That'll make more sense a little bit later in this tutorial. So now I can look at my image and I can say, do I want to dodge or burn anything? I probably do. Looking at this, I would probably burn my background out a little bit so that it really pops this foreground. To do that, I'm going to click over here, I'm going to hold down my button, and you'll find when you hold down your mouse button, all these little guys that have arrows mean that there's a bunch of other little buttons hanging out underneath them. So when you hold your button down, you get all the other options. So I'm going to hold my button down and I'm going to click on the burn tool. Now if you notice, this little circle is my brush. That's the area that will burn at a time. It's kind of large right now. Maybe I want to make it smaller, maybe I want to make it bigger. Here's how you do it. There's two ways. The first way is to right click. If you right click on your image, you can adjust the master diameter. That's the size of the actual brush. So if I go down, my brush gets smaller. If I go up, my brush gets bigger. I can make my brush huge, so huge you can't actually even see it. Here, let me go back down a little bit. Or I can make it so small that it's barely visible. The hardness is how sharp of an edge my brush has. If you're dodging and burning, for sake of dodging and burning in this case, I would leave that hardness set at 0 because you want your edges to be nice and feathered out. You don't want it to be very clear where your dodging and burning starts and stops. So that's the first way to do it. The next way to do it is to use the bracket keys. Those are the two little keys on your keyboard right next to the P key. I use these all the time. If you use the bracket to the right and you tap it several times, your brush gets bigger. If you use your bracket to the left, tap it several times, your brush gets smaller. That's actually a little faster for me than using the master diameter. So I'm going to pick a brush size that I like. And just by way of personal experience, I found that larger brushes for dodging and burning tend to create a much more uniform look. Now if you notice, I'm starting to dodge and burn. If I don't like what I've done, I can hold down my Command key and hit the letter Z, and it will undo the last step that I did. If I go Shift Command Z, it'll keep undoing steps back probably about 10 or 12 steps. Now, one quick thing to look at is right up here in the upper kind of left-hand area, there's something that says Range, Midtones, Shadows, and Highlights. I generally dodge my midtones. Sometimes you can dodge your shadows or your highlights, and I set my exposure down kind of low. What this means is how intense of a dodge you're actually going to get. If I set this at 100%, it's going to go black really quickly. Example. Command Z to undo. If I set it down to, say, 12%, it's going to hardly be visible. So depending on how much control you want over your dodging and burning, you can always go up here and do midtones, highlights, or shadows for both dodging, which is our both dodging, which is our little magnifying glass, or burning. I've been calling that dodging the entire time. So I'm going to set this probably at, say, 45 to 50%. Let's set it at 50. Then I'm going to sit here and I'm going to start burning this area in. And the reason I'm burning this in is because, for me, that's not part of the picture that I want to be really, really prevalent. Now, if you notice, as I'm doing this, at some given point, it stops burning. That's because I have it set at 50%. I'm holding my mouse button down and just moving this brush. If I let go of my mouse button and then push it again, I'll get another 50% set right on top of my first 50%. And I can sit here and I can go through and I can burn this to my heart's content. Then, when I'm done, maybe I want to dodge some other stuff. I'm going to go ahead and dodge my midtones. I'm going to set my exposure up here at the top for maybe, let's try 40%. Then I can sit here and I can dodge out what's going on in the middle. Now, for sake of actual artistry, I'd spend a lot more time doing this. I would make my brushes smaller and larger so that I could fit down here in between these in-betweens cracks, and I would spend a lot of time making sure everything was well dodged and burned. By the way, really quick, if you want to zoom into your picture, click on the little magnifying glass on the very bottom left, and we can zoom in and we can dodge specific areas. Here's a cool little function. While I'm zoomed in, if I hold my space bar, my little magnifying glass turns to a hand. That will turn to a hand no matter what tool you have selected. I can now push my mouse button, I can move my mouse and zoom around my picture. So let's say that I want to burn this little area in right here. I've zoomed in, I go back over here to my burn tool, I use my little bracket keys to make my brush a little smaller, and then I can zoom in these little areas and burn them in exactly the way that I want them burned in as well, so that it doesn't look like I'm really manipulating this image too much. Now, when I'm done and I want to zoom out, I click back on my magnifying glass, hold down my Option key, or in your case, Alt key, if you're on PC, and zoom back out. And that way, you can clean up your picture. Last but not least, in the dodge and burn area, there's a little thing called a sponge tool. A sponge tool, back up here at the top, you can either saturate or desaturate. I generally use it as saturate. I keep my flow somewhere between 29 and 30%, and then I run over areas that I want to really saturate. Like, let's say I want to saturate the color in the water. Let's say maybe I want to saturate the chair. Maybe I want to saturate this yellow over here. And then when I'm done, I have a cool saturated picture. Now, by no means is this a picture that I would obviously put up. I'd spend a lot more work on it, but you've got the idea of how it works. When I'm done, I decide I want to save this picture. To save the picture, I'm going to, first of all, make sure that these layers over here in the right-hand corner, these layers need to be flattened to a single layer. If I save it right now, it would save as a Photoshop document. When I open it back up, my layers would still be there. They'd all be ready to go. Let me show you. So if I go File, Save, and I'm going to click Save As because I don't want to save over my original. You never like to do that unless you have your original saved somewhere else. Save As, and if you notice, it says PSD after the word water. What that means is it's a Photoshop file. If you hit Save, and then you hit OK, now when you open your Photoshop file, you'll still have those two layers. You can still play with them. You can do whatever you want. However, this is not something you can upload to the web because it's not a JPEG or a bitmap or so forth. So in order for that to work, we have to go Layer, Flatten Image. Everything now becomes one layer. File, again, Save As. This time where it says Photoshop down here, click on that, pull down to JPEG, and click Save. It's going to tell you, well, it's telling me it already exists. That's because I already did this. So let's call it something else. Let's call it Water 002. There we go. JPEG, save, got it. Okay. And then we're going to save it. I always save it at maximum. It's just better. It makes sense. I think we talked about this in other tutorials. You click OK, and you are good to go. I hope you enjoyed.